The mist clung to the peaks of the Swilvan like a damp, discarded shroud. A fine, persistent drizzle kind the locals called smurwas, turning the single-track road into a ribbon of black grease. PC Hamish Macbeth, lanky and red-haired, stood by the edge of the loch, his old greatcoat damp, but his spirit momentarily untroubled. In his hand was a fishing rod, and at his feet lay a plump, silver Atlantic salmon that had, until 10 minutes ago, been minding its own business. Technically, the fishing rights for this stretch of water belonged to the estate, but Hamish had always operated on the principle that the fish didn't much care who caught them, so long as they were eaten with proper appreciation. "Easy now, lugs," Hamish murmured to the small, scruffy dog sitting expectantly by his Wellingtons. "One for the pot, and the rest is just greed." He was just reaching down to retrieve his illicit prize when the peace of the glen was shattered. It wasn't the thunder of a Highland storm, but the high-pitched, indignant whine of a precision-engineered Italian engine. A sleek, low-slung sports entirely unsuited for the potholes of Sutherland Road around the bend, splashing a wall of peat-stained water over Hamish's trousers. The car screeched to a halt in a spray of gravel, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a pristine tweed jacket that had clearly never seen a day's honest work, and a pair of designer spectacles that looked like they cost more than Hamish's annual salary. "You there, policeman!" the man shouted, his voice carrying the sharp, clipped tones of the London counting-houses. "I've been honking for a mile. Is this the only road to Glenbrae? It's a disgrace. I've nearly bottomed out twice." Hamish straightened slowly, his face settling into a mask of polite, vacant helpfulness, the stupid Highlander expression he found so useful when dealing with the hurried and the haughty. "Ah!" "It's the road," Hamish said softly, his Highland lilt thickening. "Though most folk find it's better if you take it a bit slower. The sheep, ye see. They've no been taught the highway code." The man, whose name was Julian Vanatho Hamish, didn't know that yet scoffed. "I don't have time for sheep. I am the new tenant at the castle. I expect my guests to be able to reach me without needing a tractor. And what's that behind your leg?" Hamish shifted ever so slightly, obscuring the salmon with the hem of his coat. "Just a bit of driftwood, sir. For the fire. It's a cold mist that's coming in." "Well, see you keep the riffraff away from the gates. I am hosting a house party this weekend, and I want to have the locals gawking." With a spray of gravel that narrowly missed Lug's nose, the sports car tore off toward the looming grey turrets of Glenbrae Castle. Hamish watched the taillights disappear into the fog. He sighed, picked up his fish, and patted Lugs on the head. A Sassenach with more money than sense. Lugs. And a house party in Lochdub. Hamish shook his head. "That's like dropping a fox in a hen house and wondering why there's feathers everywhere. I have a feeling my coffee's going to be getting cold a lot more often this week." He turned back toward his Land Rover, the weight of the salmon a comforting presence, though his gut told him the smur wasn't the only thing about to get heavy in the village. The salmon was destined for the frying pan, but it never quite made it. By the time Hamish had navigated the Land Rover back to his police station in Lochdub, the sky had turned the colour of an old pewter mug, and the wind was beginning to whistle through the cracks in the window frames. He had just managed to get his boots off and was reaching for the battered tin of coffee when the telephone on his desk began to shrill with a frantic, rhythmic urgency. Lugs, sensing the end of their peaceful afternoon, gave a low, mournful cry and crawled under the kitchen table. Hamish stared at the black plastic handset for a moment, hoping it might stop. It didn't. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire Highlands, he picked it up. "Lochdub Police Station, PC Macbeth speaking," he said, his voice dropping into that slow, rhythmic drawl that made city folk want to scream with impatience. The voice on the other end was not the usual local complaint about a stray cow or a noisy pub-goer. It was a woman, her breath coming in sharp, jagged gasps that suggested she was either running or hysterical. "You must come at once. It's the castle, Glenbrae. Mr. Vane, Julian, he's in the fountain." "Calm down now, whist," Hamish said, his blue eyes suddenly sharpening even as his tone remained level. "Tell me who I am speaking to, and what's happened to the gentleman. It's Mrs. Graham, the housekeeper. He's in the ornamental fountain in the Italian garden. He isn't moving, officer. And there's a pink flamingo, a plastic one. It's tucked under his arm." Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the Highland damp. Julian Vane, the arrogant man in the sports car who had just splashed him an hour ago, was now apparently a centerpiece in his own garden. "I am on my way, Mrs. Graham. Touch nothing. Do you hear me? Not a stone, not a leaf." He hung up, looked regretfully at the unmade coffee, and shoved his feet back into his damp Wellingtons. He whistled for Lugs, who reluctantly emerged from under the table, and they headed back out into the rain. The drive up to Glenbrae Castle was a sombre one. The mist had thickened, swallowing the base of the mountains, so that the peaks seemed to float in a grey void. As he pulled the Land Rover through the heavy iron gates, he saw the sports car still parked at a rakish angle near the front steps, its expensive paint job now dull under a layer of Highland mud. He found the Italian garden at the rear of the sprawling stone pile. It was a preposterous bit of landscaping, filled with marble statues of cherubs that looked miserable in the Scottish climate. In the centre was a large, circular stone basin. Slumped over the edge, face down in 6 inches of murky water, was Julian Vane. He was still wearing that pristine tweed jacket, though it was now soaked through and clinging to his frame. Just as the housekeeper had described, a bright, garish pink plastic lawn flamingo was wedged firmly under his right arm, its long yellow beak pointing up toward the gloomy sky like a mocking finger. Hamish knelt by the edge of the fountain, careful not to disturb the gravel. Lug stayed back, whining softly. Hamish didn't need a doctor to tell him the man was dead. The stillness was absolute, and the skin of the neck was the colour of curdled milk. There was a small, neat contusion at the base of the skull, but what struck Hamish most wasn't the wound, it was the flamingo. It was a cheap, tacky thing, the kind of decoration found in a suburban garden in London, not a historic Highland estate. It was a deliberate insult, a final bit of dark theatre staged by someone who clearly hadn't liked Mr. Vane very much. What a way to go, Hamish muttered to himself, his mind already cataloguing the scene. Drowned in a puddle with a toy bird for company. He stood up and looked back toward the castle. Several faces were pressed against the leaded glass windows of the drawing-room guests, no doubt, the house party Vane had mentioned. They looked pale and frightened, like birds trapped in a cage. Beyond them, he could hear the distant rhythmic throb of another engine approaching. This one wasn't a sports car, it was the heavy, aggressive sound of a police van. Hamish's heart sank. News travelled fast in the Highlands, but the speed of the siren suggested that someone had called the mainland authorities before they'd even bothered with the local village bobby. He knew that sound. It was the sound of paperwork, of shouting, and of his quiet life being trampled underfoot. "Here we go, Lugs," Hamish whispered, as the first blue light crested the hill, reflecting off the wet stone of the castle walls. "Blair will be here in 5 minutes, and then the real trouble starts." He adjusted his cap, wiped a bit of rain from his nose, and prepared to look as gormless as possible. He had a murder to solve, but more importantly, he had a reputation for incompetence to maintain if he wanted any hope of staying in Lochdub once the smoke cleared. He watched the white police van skid to a halt, the doors flying open before the engine had even died, and braced himself for the coming storm. The heavy van doors swung open with a violent thud, and out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, looking like a man who had been woken up from a very pleasant nap by a very unpleasant smell. His face was already a worrying shade of purple, a hue that usually deepened whenever he caught sight of Hamish Macbeth's lanky silhouette. Behind him trailed Detectives Anderson and McNab, looking suitably miserable in the soaking rain, their notebooks already damp and wilting. Blair didn't bother with a greeting. He stomped across the gravel, his heavy boots crunching with a sound like grinding teeth, until he stood over the fountain. He stared down at the body of Julian Vane, and then at the pink flamingo, and for a moment the only sound was the wind whistling through the castle's gutters. "What in the name of the Lord's earth is this, Macbeth?" Blair roared, his voice bouncing off the granite walls of Glenbrae. "I come all the way from Strathbane, ruining my suspension on these goat tracks you call roads, and I find a dead Sassenach being cuddled by a piece of plastic poultry. Is this some Highland joke? Have you been playing games with the evidence?" Hamish pulled his damp cap a little lower, his expression shifting into one of wide-eyed, vacant innocence. He let his shoulders slouch and his lower lip hang just a fraction. "Oh no, sir, Mr. Blair. I've no touched a thing. I just arrived myself after receiving a frantic call from the housekeeper, Mrs. Graham. The bird was there when I found him. It's a queer thing, is it no? Queer thing." Blair mimicked in a high-pitched, mocking tone. "It's a murder, you great lummox. And look at you standing there like a garden gnome while a killer is likely halfway to Inverness. Why aren't there roadblocks? Why haven't you secured the perimeter?" "Well, sir," Hamish said slowly, scratching his head as if the concept of a perimeter was a foreign and difficult mathematical equation. "The only road out of here is the one you just came up, and I figured since you were on it, you'd have seen if anyone was trying to flee in a hurry. Besides, the mist is that thick, a man could wander off the path and be in a peat bog before he knew he'd left the garden." Blair ignored him, turning his attention to the crowd of guests now huddled under the stone portico of the castle. Among them was a tall, slender woman in an expensive cashmere wrap and a man with a military bearing who was nursing a glass of what looked like very stiff scotch. Blair's eyes lit up. He loved a high-profile suspect, especially one he could bully into a confession before dinner. "Anderson! McNabb! Get those people inside. I want the drawing room secured. And Macbeth, you stay here. Try not to fall into the water or eat the evidence." "I'll just stay here and keep an eye on things then, shall I?" Hamish asked, his tone helpful to the point of irritation. "Stay here, stay there. I don't care if you stay in the loch," Blair snapped, already stomping toward the guests. "This is a Strathbane operation now. We don't need a village bobby who spends more time poaching than policing. This is clearly a case of a disgruntled local, someone who didn't like a wealthy Englishman moving into their backyard. Probably someone you know, Macbeth. Probably one of your drinking buddies from the Seaview Hotel." Hamish watched them go, Blair's shouting fading into the interior of the castle. He looked down at Luggs, who was sniffing tentatively at a patch of flattened grass near the fountain. Blair had already decided it was a local, likely because it was the easiest path to an arrest and a headline in the Scottish papers. But Hamish knew the people of Lochstub. They might grumble about a newcomer, and they might even borrow a few logs from his woods, but they didn't go around tucking plastic flamingos under the arms of corpses. That required a specific kind of militia theatrical, personal spite. He knelt, his knees clicking in the cold. While Blair was busy shouting at the gentry inside, Hamish noticed something the DCI had stepped right over in his rush to be important. Pressed into the soft mud near the fountain's edge was a small rectangular impression. It wasn't a footprint. It was the shape of a small box, perhaps a jewelry case or a tin of tobacco. And just beside it, snagged on a rose thorn, was a tiny tuft of blue wool. It wasn't the coarse, rugged wool of a Highland sweater, but something fine and delicate. Hamish carefully extracted the wool and tucked it into his pocket. He could hear Blair's muffled roars from inside the house, accusing the military-looking man of a crime of passion based on nothing more than the way the man was holding his glass. Hamish sighed, looking at the grey, indifferent sky. He would have to start his own investigation the quiet way. He would need to wander, listen and find out why a man like Julian Vane would have a plastic flamingo in the first place. "Come on, Lux," Hamish whispered. "Let's go see if Mrs. Graham has the kettle on. There's nothing like a murder to make folk want to talk over a cup of tea, especially when they think the real police are busy in the drawing room." Hamish slipped away from the fountain as the first flashes of the forensic. Photographers' bulbs began to pulse against the grey stone walls like artificial lightning. He knew Blair would be occupied for at least an hour, systematically alienating every witness in the drawing room with his trademark blend of accusation and arrogance. It was the perfect time for a bit of mooching. Hamish led Luggs toward the back entrance of the castle, the heavy oak door that led straight into the warmth of the kitchens. Here, the air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and the sharp, medicinal tang of floor wax. Mrs. Graham, the housekeeper, was sitting at a long pine table, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of tea as if it were a lifebuoy in a stormy sea. "Oh, Hamish!" she wailed as he entered, her voice a fragile red. "It's a black day for Glenbrae. To think of Mr. Vane ending up like that, and in the Italian garden of all places. He spent thousands on those marble cherubs just last month." Hamish eased himself into a chair opposite her, his long legs stretching out toward the AGA stove. He didn't pull out a notebook or adopt the stern, clipped tone of the Strathbane detectives. Instead, he looked at the teapot with a soulful, longing expression. "It's a terrible shock for ye, Mrs. Graham. A terrible shock, and the weather doesn't help matters. I don't suppose there's a drop more in that pot? My bones are feeling the smur." The tea ritual was performed with shaky efficiency. As she poured, Hamish leaned back, his eyes wandering over the pristine surfaces of the kitchen. He was a particular man, was he not, Mr. Vane? I saw him on the road earlier. Seemed in a great hurry to get the party started. A hurry. He was in a state of permanent agitation. "Hamish," Mrs. Graham whispered, leaning in closer. "The house party wasn't just for fun. It was a business thing, some big merger. He was expecting a man from Londona, Mr. Larchmont, who never arrived. And the others, well, they weren't his friends, not really. They were sharks in silk ties. They'd been arguing since the moment the gin was poured last night. I heard shouting in the library about a missing contract and someone being bled dry." Hamish nodded sympathetically, blowing his tea. "And the bird, Mrs. Graham? The pink thing? I don't recall seeing many plastic flamingos in the Highlands." Mrs. Graham's face soured. "That's the queerest part. It arrived in a box 3 days ago. No return address. Mr. Vane went purple when he saw it. He told me to throw it in the incinerator, but I thought it might belong to one of the guests as a joke, so I tucked it in the garden shed. Someone must have gone out there and got it. Hamish made a mental note of the garden shed. A toy bird that caused a man to go purple with rage wasn't a joke. It was a message. While Blair was busy asking the guests where they were at the precise moment of death, Hamish was more interested in why the victim was hated long before he hit the water. He excused himself, citing the need to check on his Land Rover, and instead made his way toward the village. He needed more than just the gossip of the castle, he needed the perspective of Lochstub. He stopped by the local curry shop, where Mr. Patel was busy preparing a batch of vegetable pakoras that smelled heavenly. In a village as small as Lochstub, news didn't travel, it telepathically projected itself. Tragic business at the castle. Macbeth, Mr. Patel said, sliding a small, greaseproof bag of warm snacks across the counter without being asked. Though I hear the victim was a bit of a shark. He tried to buy the old pier last week, wanted to turn it into a private marina for his associates. The village council nearly had a collective heart attack. Hamish chewed a pakora thoughtfully. A private marina? He wasn't planning on staying a quiet tenant then. He was planning on owning the place, Hamish. He told the minister that Lochstub was a quaint anachronism that needed dragging into the 21st century. He wasn't liked, but then, being disliked isn't a motive for murder, is it? Or half the village would be in the dock. Hamish thanked him and stepped back out into the rain, the bag of pakoras tucked into his pocket. He had learned two things. Vane was a man of immense greed who was being threatened by a plastic bird, and he had been planning to destroy the very piece Hamish lived to protect. As he walked toward the Seaview Hotel, he saw a familiar, elegant figure standing by the window of the residence lounge. It was Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. She looked troubled, her gaze fixed on the mist-shrouded loch. Hamish felt the familiar tug of his heartstrings, followed closely by the familiar realization that a lowly police constable had no business looking at a lady of the manor. But Priscilla had been at the castle for the initial drinks, and she had an eye for detail that even Hamish envied. He straightened his tie, smoothed down his wild red hair as best he could, and headed toward the hotel entrance. The mooching was over, it was time for the romantic complication. The heavy glass door of the Seaview Hotel creaked as Hamish entered, the warmth of the peat fire inside clashing with the chill of his damp greatcoat. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe was standing by the fireplace, her golden hair catching the light of the flames. She looked every bit the daughter of a baronet, composed and elegant, yet there was a tension in the set of her shoulders that Hamish knew well. When she saw him, a flicker of relief crossed her face, though it was quickly masked by her usual cool reserve. "Hamish," she said, her voice like silk over stone, "I assume you've come to escape the shouting." I could hear DCI Blair from the driveway. He's currently convinced that the Colonel's wife did it because she has a loud voice and a sturdy pair of walking boots. Hamish sighed, leaning against the mahogany bar as the proprietor, Barney, automatically began pouring a cup of coffee. "Aye, Priscilla. Mr. Blair is a man who likes his villains to be obvious and his paperwork to be short. He's no much for the subtleties of a plastic flamingo." He took a grateful sip of the hot, bitter liquid. "You were there last night, at the start of it all. What did you make of Mr. Vane's little gathering? It didn't sound like a party for the faint of heart." Priscilla moved closer, lowering her voice. It was ghastly, Hamish. Julian Vane wasn't just arrogant, he was desperate. He was hosting that party to secure funding for a property scheme that sounded more like a ransom note than a business deal. But the real friction was not money. It was about Angela. "Angela?" Hamish asked, his ears pricking. "Angela Vane, his wife. Or rather, his soon-to-be ex-wife. She was there with her cousin, a man named Marcus, who looks like he spent more time in a gym than in an office. Julian was taunting her all evening, calling her the flamingo in front of everyone. I thought it was just a cruel nickname for her penchant for bright pink dresses, but when I heard about the bird in the fountain it felt different. Hamish felt the tuft of blue wool in his pocket. The flamingo, and did this Marcus fellow seem the type to appreciate a bit of garden theatre? "Marcus is the type to appreciate whatever Angela tells him to," Priscilla replied dryly. "But there's something else, Hamish. Something about the seating arrangements. Julian had placed a blue folder at the head of the table before dinner contract Mr. Patel mentioned, I suspect. When the shouting started in the library, that folder went missing. Julian was frantic, accusing everyone from the minister to the maid. He wasn't just killed because he was a Sassenach with a loud car, Hamish. He was killed because he had something someone else wanted back." She reached into her small clutch bag and pulled out a damp piece of paper. "I found this near the umbrella stand when I was leaving. It's a dry cleaning receipt for a blue wool coat. It's dated 2 days ago, and the name on it isn't Vane or Marcus. It's Larchmont." Hamish took the slip of paper, his mind whirring. "The London man who never arrived. Thank you, Priscilla. You have a better eye for the wreckage than Blair has for the road. Be careful, Hamish, she said, her eyes softening for a brief second. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and Angela is looking for a fortune. Between the two of them, a village policeman could easily get lost in the fog. Hamish nodded, finishing his coffee and whistling for Lugs, who had been dozing by the fire. He retreated to Highland night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air felt heavier than before. Priscilla had given him the thread, and the blue wool in his pocket now had a name attached to it. If Larchmont had been at the castle, then Blair was investigating a house party that had a ghost for a guest. He did not return to the castle immediately. Instead, he made his way toward the old pier, the place Vane had wanted to destroy. He needed a moment of quiet to think, to let the gossip and the clues settle like the silt at the bottom of the loch. As he walked, he saw a light flickering in the window of the old boathousier place that should have been empty and locked for the season. It was a small thing, a tiny deviation from the village routine. But in Lochdub, a small thing was often the start of a very big lie. The light in the boathouse flickered once more, a pale, stuttering yellow that looked out of place against the deep velvet black of the loch. Hamish crouched low, his boots sinking into the sodden peat as he approached. Lugs remained at his side, his hackles raised but mercifully silent. Through the salt-crusted window of the shack, Hamish saw a man frantically stuffing papers into a briefcase. He was wearing a blue wool overcoat, one that looked remarkably similar to the fibre snagged on the rose thorn. But the man's hands were shaking so violently, he dropped his torch. The beam rolled across the floor, illuminating the face of the missing Londoner, Mr. Larchmont. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a cornered rabbit. Before Hamish could make his move, the silence of the pier was shattered by the distant, rhythmic wail of a siren and the crunch of gravel. Blair's van was screaming back toward the village from the castle. Hamish realized with a sinking feeling that the DCI had reached a conclusion. He watched as the police vehicle skidded to a halt outside the cottage of Archie Maclean, a local fisherman known for his short temper and his long-standing grudge against anyone who tried to interfere with the water rights. No, 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 Hamish muttered, standing up and abandoning his watch in the boathouse. Not Archie! He ran toward the cottage, Lugs darting ahead. He arrived just as Blair was hauling a bewildered Archie out into the rain by his collar. Archie was still in his undershirt, his face a mask of groggy confusion. "I've got him, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his face glowing with a triumphant manic energy. Found a pair of muddy boots on his porch and a motif as wide as the Atlantic. Maclean was heard threatening to drown that Sassenach in his own vanity down at the pub last Tuesday. Case closed, arresting him for the murder of Julian Vane. "But Mr. Blair, sir," Hamish interjected, breathless and feigning a desperate sort of clumsiness as he tripped over a loose stone. "Archie's boots are always muddy. He's a fisherman, and he says things like that about everyone, including the postman when the mail is late. You can't just cart him off to Strathbane for a bit of pub talk." "Watch me," Blair sneered, shoving Archie toward the open van. The man's a local thug. He hated Vane's plans for the pier, and he's got the muscle to have held Vane under the water. It's a perfect fit. "Get out of the way, Macbeth, before I arrest you for obstructing justice with your sheer stupidity." Hamish stood back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at Archie, whose eyes were wide with a mix of fear and fury. "Don't you worry, Archie!" Hamish called out softly. The truth has a way of coming out, even in the rain. As the van sped away, its siren fading into a lonely echo, Hamish turned back toward the boathouse. But the light was gone. Larchmont had used the distraction of Archie's arrest to vanish into the darkness. Hamish walked slowly back to the fountain at the castle, the scene now abandoned by the forensic team but still cordoned off by yellow tape that whipped in the wind. He stood by the edge of the water, looking at the spot where the flamingo had been. Blair's arrest of Archie was a classic red herring, a convenient solution that ignored the theatricality of the crime. Archie Maclean would have broken a man's jaw in a fair fight, but he wouldn't have used a plastic bird as a prop. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out the dry-cleaning receipt Priscilla had given him. He then looked at the impression in the mud Aganathy, one that matched a small box. He realized then that Blair had missed the most important detail of all. The flamingo wasn't just a nickname for Julian's wife, it was a code. And Larchmont hadn't been hiding in the boathouse because he was the killer, he was hiding because he was terrified of the person who actually was. The blue wool snagged on the thorn hadn't come from a struggle, it had come from someone reaching into the fountain after Vane was already dead to retrieve that missing blue folder. Hamish felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The motive wasn't the pier, and it wasn't the business merger. It was something far more petty and far more dangerous. He needed to find Larchmont before the killer did, and he needed to do it without Blair finding out that his perfect suspect was currently sitting in a cell for a crime he didn't have the imagination to commit. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish said, his voice hardening. "We need to go back to the castle. There's one person who hasn't shed a single tear today, and I think it's time I asked her why she's so fond of pink." The walk back up the long, winding drive to Glenbrae Castle was a silent one, save for the rhythmic squelch of Hamish's boots in the mud. The grand house sat atop the rise like a brooding stone giant, its windows glowing with a deceptive warmth. Hamish knew that inside, the guests were likely celebrating their narrow escape from Blair's clumsy interrogations, while poor Archie McLean was sitting in a cold cell in Strathbane, wondering how a bit of pub talk had turned into a murder charge. But Hamish wasn't looking at the May house. He was looking at the small, darkened windows of the north wing, where Angela Vane had retreated to recover from the shock of her husband's demise. He entered through the kitchen again, finding it empty this time, the fire in the AGA dying down to a dull orange glow. He made his way up the back stairs, his movements fluid and quiet, a far cry from the bumbling policeman he played for the public. He reached the door to the morning room and paused, hearing the low, urgent murmur of voices. He didn't knock. Instead, he eased the door open just a crack. Angela Vane was standing by the window, no longer wrapped in a mourning shawl but wearing a sharp, tailored suit. Beside her stood Marcus, the cousin Priscilla had mentioned. He was holding the very blue folder Hamish had been looking for. "We have to burn it, Angela," Marcus was saying, his voice tight with anxiety. "If the auditors see these signatures, the whole estate is forfeit. Julian was going to use this to prove Yaud been siphoning the funds into the offshore account since 2023. Julian is at the bottom of a fountain, Marcus." "Don't be so dramatic," Angela replied, her voice as cold as the sleet hitting the glass. "He thought he was so clever, calling me the flamingo in front of his associates, mocking the fact that I liked the high life on his dime. He actually bought that hideous plastic bird just to put it on the dinner table as a centerpiece to humiliate me. He was going to announce the divorce and the fraud charges tonight." Hamish entered the room, his presence suddenly filling the small space. "And that would have been a very social embarrassment, would it no?" he asked softly. Angela spun around, her face momentarily pale before she composed herself into a mask of regal indignation. "Officer Macbeth, you gave me a fright. Shouldn't you be out chasing your fisherman? I believe your superior was quite certain of his guilt." Hamish wandered to the fireplace, looking at the empty grate. "Aye, Mr. Blair is a man of great certainties. But I've always been a man of questions. Like, for instance, why a man would be found with a plastic bird under his arm. You see, Mrs. Vane, I thought at first the killer put it there to mock him. But then I realized Julian probably had it with him when he went to meet someone in the garden. He was going to use it as a final insult before he handed over the papers to the police." He turned to look at Marcus, whose knuckles were white as he gripped the blue folder. "And then there's the matter of Mr. Larchmont. He wasn't late for the party. He was hiding. He saw what happened, didn't he? He saw Marcus, or perhaps you, Mrs. Vane, struggling with Julian by the fountain. A little push, a hit to the head on the marble cherub, and the problem goes away. But in the chaos, the folder fell into the water. Someone had to go back for its Samione in a fine blue wool coat." "You have no proof of any of this," Angela hissed, her eyes narrowing. "You're a village policeman with a dog and a penchant for poaching. My lawyers will have you back in a beat in the Shetlands before the week is out." "Oh, sure. They're very expensive lawyers," Hamish said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the tuft of blue wool. "But this little scrap of wool matches the coat Mr. Larchmont was wearing in the boathouse. He's quite a chatty man when he's scared, Mrs. Vane. He told me he saw Marcus here fishing this folder out of the fountain while you watched from the terrace. It seems Julian wasn't the only one who knew about the fraud. Larchmont wanted a piece of the pie to keep quiet. The motive wasn't the grand property scheme or the pier. It was the oldest, pettiest story in the book, a marriage built on theft and a man who pushed his wife one insult too far. The flamingo wasn't a murder weapon, it was a trigger." Marcus paced Hamish, his face darkening. "You're a long way from help, Macbeth. Blair is miles away." Hamish didn't flinch. He just smiled, a slow, deceptive Highland smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Aye, but in Lochdub, news travels faster than a siren. And I think Yow'll find that when a man tries to threaten a policeman in his own village, the locals tend to take it a bit personally." Marcus took another predatory step forward, his chest heaving under his expensive shirt. The blue folder was clutched in his hand like a shield, but his eyes were darting toward the heavy brass fire irons. Angela Vane remained by the window, her silhouette sharp against the encroaching Highland night, her silence more damning than any confession. Hamish, however, merely leaned back against a mahogany sideboard, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus that he wasn't particularly bothered about catching. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon or handcuffs, but for the small greaseproof bag Mr. Patel had given him. He pulled out a cold vegetable pakora and took a thoughtful bite. "You see, Marcus," Hamish said, his voice muffled slightly by the snack, "the trouble with folk from the city is that they think silence is something you buy. In Lochstub, silence is something we share. It's a very loud kind of silence." He looked over at Angela. "You told me earlier that Mr. Larchmont never arrived. But the thing about this village is that everyone sees everything. Young Willie Lamont was out checking his lobster pots when he saw a man in a blue coat being rowed across the loch in the dead of night. And Mrs. Graham? She noticed that 2 sets of dinner service were taken up to the north wing yesterday afternoon, not one. You've been keeping him here, haven't you? Tucked away like a shameful secret until you could decide if he was a witness or an accomplice." Angela's eyes flashed with a cold blue fire. "Willie Lamont is a half-wit and Mrs. Graham is a gossip. No court in the land will take the word of a few peasants over mine. You have nothing, Macbeth, just a bit of wool and a vivid imagination. Now, get out of my house before I call the chief constable and have your badge." Hamish sighed, appearing to deflate under her anger. He looked down at his boots, a picture of defeated Highland dejection. "Perhaps you're right, Mrs. Vane. I'm just a village boggy. My word against yours, it's no much of a contest, is it? And with Archie McLean already in the van, Blair will be happy to call it a day. He's probably halfway through writing the press release as we speak." He started to shuffle toward the door, whistling softly for lugs. "I suppose I'll just go and tell Mr. Larchmont he's free. The poor man is shivering down in the old boathouse. I told him I'd come back for him once I'd cleared things up here." The room air suddenly changed. The tension, which had been a taut wire, snapped. Marcus went ashen, and even Angela's composure wavered. "The boathouse?" Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "But he's in the—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening as he realized the trap had just been sprung. "In the attic? In the cellar?" Hamish finished for him, his voice losing its lazy lilt and becoming as sharp as a Highland frost. "I knew he wasn't in the boathouse, Marcus. I just needed to see which one of you would panic first. You see, a man like Larchmont doesn't just vanish unless he's being helped or held. And if he's being held, then the person holding him is the one who really needs those papers in your hand to disappear." Hamish straightened his back, suddenly appearing much taller and more formidable than the bumbling constable they had mocked earlier. "I've already sent a radio message to the mainland, but no to Blair. I sent it to the Procurator Fiscal's office. I told them that the missing witness, Mr. Larchmont, was currently being detained at Glenbrae Castle against his will. I also mentioned that the evidence of the fraud blue folder was about to be destroyed. In reality, Hamish had sent no such message. The radio in his Land Rover was currently acting as a paperweight for a stack of unpaid bills. But vanity and guilt are a powerful combination. Angela looked at the fireplace, then at the folder in Marcus' hand, her mind racing to find a way to pivot, to lie, to charm her way out. But Hamish didn't give her the chance. "The village is watching, Mrs. Vane," Hamish said, his voice low and steady. "Every window in Lochstub has a pair of eyes behind it tonight. You can't burn the truth in a glass house. Now, Marcus, why don't you hand over that folder? It's a heavy thing to carry, and I think you've both done quite enough heavy lifting for one day." The sound of a heavy door slamming downstairs echoed through the house, followed by the unmistakable high-pitched bark of a police siren. This time, it wasn't a bluff. The local doctor, who acted as the medical examiner, had arrived with a backup unit Hamish had requested before his mooching had even begun. The trap wasn't just words. It was the slow, inevitable arrival of the law that Hamish had orchestrated, while everyone else was looking the other way. The siren's wail acted like a jagged blade, cutting through the thick, suffocating tension of the morning room. For Marcus, the sound was the final tether snapping. His face, once handsome in a vacuous, athletic way, contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked at Angela, who had turned away to stare at the door with a cold, aristocratic detachment, and realized he was being left to drown. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the muscle, the errand boy who had waded into a frozen fountain to retrieve a dead man's secrets, and now the law was at the gates. "I'm not going to jail for you, Angela," Marcus screamed, the sound echoing harshly off the ornate plaster ceiling. "I didn't even want to push him. You said he was going to ruin us." In a sudden, violent motion, he lunged, not toward the door, but toward Hamish. He was a foot shorter than the constable, but built like a Highland bull, and he moved with the desperate speed of a man who saw the bars of a cell closing in. He threw his weight forward, aiming to plough through Hamish and reach the back staircase. Hamish, however, was no longer the slouching, slow-moving village bogey. The deceptive laziness vanished in a heartbeat. As Marcus charged, Hamish stepped lightly to the Cydia movement, as fluid as a salmon darting through a stream, and used the man's own momentum against him. He caught Marcus' leading arm, twisting it with a sharp, expert levering motion that sent the larger man sprawling across the mahogany sideboard. Crystal decanters rattled and smashed, the scent of expensive malt whiskey filling the air like a funeral libation. Marcus scrambled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, his eyes wild. He grabbed a heavy silver candelabra from the mantel and swung it in a wide, desperate arc. Hamish ducked, the metal whistling inches above his red hair, and stepped into the man's guard. With a strength that few in Lochdub realized he possessed, Hamish delivered a short, sharp blow to Marcus' solar plexus, followed by a sweeping kick to the back of his knees. Marcus hit the floor with a bone-jarring thud, the wind whistling out of him in a long, pathetic wheeze. Luggs was on him in an instant, barking with a ferocity that belied his size, his teeth snapping inches from Marcus' nose. "Stay down now, man," Hamish panted, his voice low and dangerous. "You've done enough damage to the furniture and the peace of this glen. It's over." Angela Vane hadn't moved. She watched the struggle with the bored curiosity of someone observing a particularly dull play. "How very common," she remarked, her voice steady. "A brawl in the morning room. I trust Yow'll clean up the glass, officer." "The only thing being cleaned up tonight is the guest list, Mrs. Vane," Hamish replied, keeping a firm knee on Marcus' back as he reached for the heavy twine he often carried in his basque, habit from his poaching days that proved far more reliable than standard-issue handcuffs. He bound Marcus' wrists with quick, efficient knots. The door opened, and this time it wasn't a bluff. A young constable from the mainland unit rushed in, followed by the village doctor. They took in the scene: the smashed crystal, the bound suspect, the cold woman by the window, and Hamish Macbeth, looking slightly dishevelled but entirely in control. "He's all yours," Hamish said to the young officer, standing up and brushing a stray bit of red hair from his eyes. "Mister, Marcus here has a lot to say about a blue folder and a fountain. And I believe Yow'll find Mr. Larchmont locked in the linen closet on the 3rd floor. Hell be wanting a blanket and a very long talk with the Procurator Fiscal." Hamish turned to Angela. "As for you, madam, I'd suggest you find a coat. The station in Strathbane is a draughty place, and they don't serve gin and tonics." As the officers led the two, silence returned to Glenbrae. But it was a different kind of silence now, heavy, hollow quiet of an empty house. Hamish walked over to the sideboard and picked up the blue folder, which had fallen to the floor during the scuffle. He looked at it for a long moment before tucking it under his arm. The crime was solved, the killers were in custody, and the mystery of the flamingo had been laid bare. But, as he looked out at the lights of the police cars snaking down the drive, he felt the familiar, looming shadow of his own success. "Well, Luggs," he whispered, patting the dog's head, "we've done it again. And that means Blair is going to be looking for someone to promote. We'd better get to work on making sure he thinks he did the whole thing himself, or we'll be walking a beat in Glasgow by Monday morning." The rain had turned back into a soft, ghostly drizzle by the time DCI Blair's van screeched back into the courtyard of Glenbrae Castle. The DCI exploded from the vehicle like a champagne cork under too much pressure, his face a vivid, pulsating purple that suggested a looming medical emergency. He had spent the last hour at the station in a state of high dudgeon, only to be told by a frantic radio dispatch that the useless Macbeth had already secured 2 suspects and a missing witness. He stomped into the morning room, his boots squelching on the expensive carpet, and found Hamish standing by the window, looking thoroughly defeated. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, the veins in his neck standing out like corded rope. "What in the name of the Highlands is going on here? I leave you for 1 hour to process a simple arrest, and I find you've turned this crime scene into a 3-ring circus. Why are the veins in the back of a mainland unit? And who is this man Thayer dragging out of the linen closet?" Hamish looked up, his eyes wide and blinking, a picture of absolute bumbling contrition. He leaned heavily on his crook, letting the blue folder peek out from under his arm just enough to be noticed. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, Mr. Blair, sir. It's been a terrible muddle. I was just trying to keep the peace, like you told me, but then everything started happening at once. I am afraid I've made a mess of your brilliant strategy." Blair narrowed his eyes, his ego momentarily overriding his rage. "My strategy? What are you talking about?" "Speak sense!" "Well," Hamish said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, his Highland drawl thickening until it was almost a syrup. "I saw what you were doing when you arrested Archie McClan. It was a masterstroke, sir. A proper feint. You knew that by arresting the most obvious local, the real killers would think they were safe and start acting careless. And it worked as planned. No sooner had you driven off than Marcus and Mrs. Vane started arguing about these very papers here. He tapped the blue folder with a long, bony finger. They thought I was too thick to notice, but I remembered what you said about following greed. If you hadn't flushed them out by taking Archie, I'd never have had the wits to look in the morning room. Blair blinked, his chest swelling as the lie began to take root in his mind. He looked at the folder, then at the shattered crystal on the floor. Well, of course it was a feint, Macbeth. Even a village idiot should have seen that. I knew McLean was a red herring. I just needed to put the pressure on the inner circle. It was genius, sir, Hamish continued, nodding fervently. Pure genius. And when Marcus attacked Mule, I only managed to trip him up because I was remembering the hand-to-hand combat seminar you gave in Strathbane last year. I just applied your principles of momentum and leverage. If it hadn't been for your training, he'd have gone right over me. Blair preened, smoothing his wet lapels. The prospect of a promotion, a commendation, and perhaps a glowing write-up in the press and journal began to dance before his eyes. Yes, well, it's good to see someone was paying attention for once. I suppose I can take it from here, Macbeth. You've done adequate work in maintaining the perimeter I established.
Oh, thank you, sir.
That's a weight off my mind, Hamish said, looking immensely relieved. I was so worried Yao'd be cross that I moved the suspects before you could personally handcuff them. But since it was your plan all along, I suppose Yao'll be wanting to lead the press conference. Reporters are already gathering at the Seaview Hotel. Thea calling it the flamingo murder. Only a mind like yours could have pieced together the symbolism of that bird, Mr. Blair. The flamingo symbolism. Yes, naturally, Blair muttered, his mind already composing the headlines. Right, Anderson, MacNab. Get this folder to the car. We're heading to the hotel. Macbeth, stay here and finish the paperwork. And for heaven's sake, try to look like a professional for the remaining guests. Hamish watched them go, Blair's stride now filled with the swagger of a conquering hero. The DCI didn't even look back as he hauled the evidence away, convinced he was the architect of the most successful sting operation in the history of the Northern Constabulary. As the taillights faded into the mist, Hamish let out a long, slow breath. His shoulders dropped their defensive slouch, and a dry, skeptical smile touched his lips. He had avoided the promotion, he had avoided the city, and Archie McLean would be home in time for breakfast once Blair realized the fisherman had served his purpose as a decoy. Well, Lugs, Hamish said, reaching into his pocket for the last bit of Mr. Patel's pakora. He's happy, the fiscal is happy, the fiscal is happy, and most importantly, we're still in Lockstub. Let's go home. I think there's a salmon in the sink that's been waiting for a frying pan far too long. The sky over Lockstub had finally cleared, leaving behind a world that looked as though it had been scrubbed clean by the hands of a vengeful deity. The morning sun, pale and hesitant, glinted off the surface of the loch, turning the water into a sheet of beaten silver. Inside the small police station cottage, the air was thick with the much-anticipated aroma of frying fish and the comforting dark scent of oversteeped coffee. Hamish Macbeth, now dressed in a comfortably frayed jumper that would have made DCI Blair's blood pressure skyrocket, moved about his tiny kitchen with the slow, rhythmic grace of a man who had no intention of being anywhere else. Luggs sat by the stove, his tail thumping a steady beat against the linoleum. The excitement of the previous night had faded into a pleasant memory, and the only remnant of the Glenbrae Castle affair was a small, damp piece of blue wool sitting on the windowsill, looking like nothing more than a bit of lint. The morning papers had already arrived via the early bus from Strathbane, and the headlines were exactly what Hamish had hoped for. Blair Crack's castle killing screamed the Northern Times, accompanied by a photograph of the DCI, looking remarkably like a puffed-up bullfrog, standing triumphantly next to a covered body. The article spoke at length about Blair's intricate decoy strategy and his keen psychological insight into the mind of the killer. There was a single small sentence at the very bottom mentioning that a local constable had assisted with the arrests. Hamish smiled as he flipped salmon into the pan. The fish was pink and perfect, a far cry from the garish plastic bird that had started the whole mess. He had spent the early hours of the dawn ensuring that Archie McLean was released with a car. Formal apology from the Forcing Apology Blair had framed as a necessary part of the undercover ruse. Archie had been grumpy, as was his nature, but a bottle of Glenfiddich, quietly dropped off on his porch by a lanky, red-haired figure, had gone a long way towards smoothing over the indignity of a night in the cells. A light knock at the door broke his reverie. He didn't need to check the window to know who it was. The subtle, expensive scent of jasmine always preceded Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. He opened the door to find her standing there in a crisp hacking jacket, looking as though the Highlands had been designed specifically to serve as her backdrop. "I see you've successfully avoided the limelight again, Hamish," she said, stepping into the warmth of the cottage. She glanced at the newspaper on the table and gave a short, elegant snort of derision. "DCI Blair is currently holding court at the hotel, telling anyone who will listen how he personally wrestled Marcus to the ground. He seems to have forgotten your existence entirely." "Aye, well, it's a convenient kind of amnesia, Priscilla," Hamish replied, pouring her a mug of coffee. "The man has a career to build, and I have a garden to weed. It's a fair trade. If I'd taken the credit, the chief constable would have had me in a suit and a desk in Inverness before the salmon had gone cold."
"Can you imagine me in a city?"
ID wilt like a hothouse flower. Priscilla took the mug, her eyes lingering on his for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You're a fraud, Hamish Macbeth. You're the smartest man in this county, and you spend half your life pretending to be a simpleton so you can poach fish and drink tea. Does it never bother you? Letting a man like Blair take the glory for your work." Hamish plated the salmon and sat down, gesturing for her to join him. He looked out the window at the mountains, the ancient stone giants that had seen 1,000 petty human dramas come and go. "Glory is a heavy thing to carry, Priscilla. It brings expectations, and expectations bring paperwork. Down here, I know which way the wind is blowing before it hits the glen. I know who's cheating at cards and who's got a heart of gold under a sour face. That's enough for me." They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the distant cry of a gull. The mystery was over, the Sassenach greed had been purged from the castle, and the village had returned to its slow, sceptical routine. Angela Vane and Marcus were facing a litany of charges that would keep their expensive lawyers busy for years, and Mr. Larchmont had been safely escorted back to London, likely never to set foot north of the border again. As Priscilla rose to leave, she paused at the door. "By the way, Hamish, I heard a rumour that a new tenant is moving into the old manse next month. An artist from Brighton. Apparently, he plans to paint the loch in neon colours." Hamish groaned, a low, playful sound. "Neon? Well, I suppose I'd better start practising my bewildered local face again. It sounds like I might be needing it." He watched her walk away toward the village, her stride confident and easy. When she was out of sight, he closed the door and returned to his seat. He picked up his fork, took a bite of the illicit salmon, and sighed with deep, genuine contentment. The fire was warm, his dog was fed, and for at least one more day, Lockstub's peace belonged entirely to him.